A 12-year-old black boy was forced off a plane, humiliated in front of dozens of passengers, all because a flight attendant refused to believe he deserved to sit in first class. But just when she thought she had won, a powerful figure boarded the plane, turning the whole situation upside down. This is a story about injustice, power, and the fight for equality. Watch until the end to see how one moment changed an entire industry. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to H2 Black Thread for more powerful stories. The air inside Atlanta Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport buzzed with the rhythmic sounds of rolling suitcases, overhead announcements, and the murmurs of thousands of travelers navigating their way through the bustling terminals. Screens flickered with departure times, and airline personnel hurried from gate to gate, directing the never-ending flow of passengers. Among the sea of travelers was Jordan Mitchell, a 12-year-old boy with deep brown skin, curly black hair, and bright eyes filled with anticipation. Unlike most kids his age, Jordan wasn't intimidated by the enormity of the airport or the complexity of air travel. Instead, he embraced it with excitement. Ever since he could remember, he had been fascinated by airplanes, their mechanics, their designs, the science behind how they soared through the sky. His love for aviation wasn't just a fleeting childhood interest, it was in his blood. After all, his father, Christopher Mitchell, was the CEO of Summit Airways, one of the leading airlines in the country. Despite his father's powerful status, Jordan had been raised to value humility, respect, and determination. He wasn't the type to flaunt his family's wealth or demand special treatment. If anything, he preferred to blend in, to earn respect through his knowledge and actions rather than his last name. Today was a special day, his first solo flight. It wasn't just another trip, it was a milestone, a test of his independence. He was flying to Chicago, where his father was waiting for him, and he was determined to handle everything on his own. With a neatly packed backpack slung over his shoulders, Jordan moved through the terminal with confidence. Inside the bag were his essentials: snacks, headphones, a notebook, and most importantly, his favorite aviation books. He had read them all before, but he never got tired of learning about the different types of aircraft, their engineering, and the remarkable pilots who had made history. As he reached the check-in counter, a polite yet firm Summit Airways agent scanned his first-class ticket, verified his identity, and handed him his boarding pass with a warm smile. "You're all set, young man. Enjoy your flight," she said, nodding approvingly. Jordan smiled back, feeling a surge of excitement. "Thank you." After passing through security, where the TSA agents barely spared him a second glance, he found himself at the departure gate. He checked the time. There were still 20 minutes before boarding. Taking a seat near the window, he watched with fascination as various aircraft taxied to and from the runways. He imagined himself in the cockpit, guiding a plane full of passengers through the skies, making flawless landings and experiencing the sheer thrill of piloting. The thought made him grin. One day, he would be a pilot, maybe even the CEO of Summit Airways, just like his dad. When the gate agent announced that first-class passengers could board, Jordan rose from his seat, adjusting his backpack. The other passengers, mostly business professionals in sleek suits, barely noticed him as they filed onto the jet bridge. He was the only child in the first-class cabin, but he didn't feel out of place. He had a valid ticket. He belonged here just as much as anyone else. As he entered the luxurious first-class section, he was greeted by the soft lighting, plush leather seats, and the subtle scent of fresh coffee being brewed for the passengers. The spacious layout was nothing new to him. He had flown first class before, but he still admired how well designed the cabin was. Jordan located seat 2A, positioned near the window, and settled in comfortably. He placed his backpack under the seat in front of him and immediately pulled out one of his books, The Evolution of Aviation, from the Wright Brothers to the Future. His fingers traced the bold letters on the cover before he flipped to a bookmarked page about the Boeing 787 Dreamliner, one of his favorite aircraft. A flight attendant passed by, offering pre-flight drinks. Jordan politely declined, too engrossed in his reading to bother with refreshments. The plane's engines hummed softly in the background as more passengers trickled in, finding their seats and stowing their luggage. Jordan barely noticed them. He was lost in his own world, surrounded by the history and mechanics of aviation. But just as he was about to dive into the next section, a shadow fell over his seat. A woman in a crisp flight attendant uniform stood before him. Her name tag read Rachel Simmons, and her face was set in a neutral, almost scrutinizing expression. "Excuse me," she said, her tone sharp yet professional. "Are you sure you're in the right seat?" Jordan blinked, momentarily caught off guard. He had expected maybe a friendly conversation about aviation or even a casual greeting. Instead, her words sounded more like an interrogation. Yes, ma'am. This is seat 2A, he responded, trying to keep his voice polite. Rachel's eyes narrowed slightly, scanning him from head to toe as if evaluating whether he truly belonged in first class. "First class isn't for standby passengers or upgrades," she said curtly. "This section is reserved for paying customers." Jordan's stomach tightened. He could feel the eyes of some nearby passengers shifting toward him. "I have a ticket," he said, quickly reaching into his hoodie pocket and pulling it out. He handed it to her, hoping to put an end to the confusion. Rachel barely looked at the ticket before shaking her head dismissively. "I'm sorry, but this doesn't seem right," she muttered. "I need you to step aside while I check with the crew." Jordan felt his face heat up. Why was she acting like this? Why wasn't she even checking the system? This was his seat. His ticket was valid. He hadn't done anything wrong. Passengers were now openly watching. Some whispered among themselves. A sinking feeling settled in his chest. Something about her tone, her attitude, the way she barely glanced at his ticket. It wasn't just about a possible mistake. She didn't believe he was supposed to be here. For the first time since arriving at the airport, Jordan felt uncomfortable, out of place. He had read about discrimination before, he had heard stories, but experiencing it firsthand was different. It was humiliating. Rachel crossed her arms, her expression firm. "Either you move now, or I'll have to call security." Jordan swallowed hard. His fingers tightened around his book, but his voice came out softer this time. "But this is my seat." She didn't respond. Instead, she motioned toward the front of the plane. Feeling a lump form in his throat, Jordan hesitated before slowly standing up and grabbing his backpack. With each step toward the front of the aircraft, he felt the weight of 100 stares pressing down on him. Passengers whispered, but no one spoke up. No one defended him. As he stepped off the plane, his excitement from earlier had completely disappeared. Standing alone in the terminal, he struggled to keep his composure. This wasn't how the flight was supposed to go. This wasn't supposed to happen at all. Jordan stood frozen in place, gripping the strap of his backpack as Rachel Simmons loomed over him. The weight of her cold, scrutinizing gaze bore down on him, making the plush first-class seat suddenly feel like an unfamiliar battleground rather than a comfortable place to relax before takeoff. The hum of the plane's air circulation system, the occasional clink of a glass from the flight attendants preparing the cabin, and the murmur of conversation among the passengers all seemed to fade into the background. All that remained was Rachel's piercing eyes and disapproving stance. "Are you sure this is your seat?" she asked again, her tone laced with doubt. Jordan blinked, momentarily stunned. He had been polite, even when she first questioned him, but something about the way she asked again, as if she had already decided he didn't belong, made his stomach churn. "Yes, ma'am," he said, doing his best to sound respectful. "This is seat 2A." Rachel didn't move. She didn't nod or even glance at the ticket in his hand. Instead, she narrowed her eyes as if assessing whether he was lying. "First class isn't for standby passengers or upgrades," she said flatly. "This section is reserved for paying customers." Jordan stared at her, confused. Why was she assuming he didn't pay for his ticket? He could feel his heartbeat quicken as a few heads in the cabin turned toward them, curious about the unfolding interaction. "I have a ticket," he said quickly, reaching into his hoodie pocket and pulling out the crisp boarding pass he had received at the gate. He extended it toward her, trying his best to keep his hands steady. Rachel barely spared it a glance. She didn't check the seat assignment. She didn't scan it into her system. She simply shook her head, a smirk curling at the corner of her lips as if she had already made up her mind. "Nice try," she said. "You really expect me to fall for this?" Jordan felt his stomach drop. "Excuse me," he asked, his voice quieter this time. Rachel exhaled sharply as if she was growing impatient. "I've seen this before," she said. "People creating fake tickets to try and sneak into first class. It's not going to work." The words hit him like a slap across the face. Fake. Did she really just say he forged his ticket? Jordan's hands tightened around the boarding pass, his knuckles turning white. He opened his mouth to protest, but Rachel wasn't listening. She had already made up her mind, her arms now crossed over her chest, the finality of her decision radiating from her stiff posture. "I need you to move to the back of the plane," she said firmly. The humiliation burned in his chest, rising up to his throat. He had never been accused of lying like this before, never been made to feel like he was some kind of intruder. Jordan swallowed hard. "But," he started, his voice trembling slightly, "I'm not lying. You can check the system. My name is Jordan Mitchell. My father—" Rachel raised a hand, cutting him off. "It doesn't matter who your father is," she said curtly. Jordan felt a pang of frustration. She wasn't even listening. "Please, just scan my ticket," he tried again, holding it out desperately. Rachel didn't even bother taking it. "Sir, you need to leave now." By now, the first-class cabin had fallen completely silent. The businessmen in suits, the travelers sipping their complimentary drinks, the elderly couple seated nearby, they were all watching. Jordan could feel every single pair of eyes on him. His skin prickled with embarrassment. His face felt hot, though whether it was from anger or humiliation, he wasn't sure. He glanced around, hoping, just hoping, that someone might say something. Someone must have seen what was happening. Someone must have noticed that he had done nothing wrong. But no one said a word. They just watched. A few of them exchanged looks, ones that Jordan couldn't quite read. Some of them looked away, suddenly interested in their phones, their drinks, their conversations. No one spoke up. No one stood up for him. Rachel sighed as if this was a chore for her, as if Jordan was just another problem she had to remove. "Fine," she muttered. She reached for the phone attached to the wall of the cabin. Jordan's heart pounded in his chest. "This is Rachel Simmons," she spoke into the receiver. "I need security at Gate 14, Flight 382. We have a passenger refusing to comply." Jordan's stomach dropped even further. Refusing to comply. She was making it sound like he was causing trouble, like he was some kind of threat. The whispers in the cabin grew louder now. He could hear them, little murmurs just loud enough to make his ears burn. What's happening? Did he try to sneak into first class? Poor kid, but I mean, they don't usually let kids sit alone up here, do they? Jordan clenched his fists, his breathing shaky. He had never felt so small. It took less than a minute for two airport security officers to arrive. One of them, a tall man with a bored expression, stepped forward. "What seems to be the problem?" Rachel turned to him, her arms still crossed. "This passenger is in a seat that does not belong to him," she said. "He has been asked to move, but he is refusing to comply." The officer turned to Jordan. "All right, kid, let's go." Jordan felt the lump in his throat grow bigger. He wanted to argue, to demand they check the system, to make anyone, listen to him. But the officers weren't asking. They were telling him. Jordan stood up slowly, his body heavy with humiliation. As he grabbed his backpack and stepped into the aisle, he risked one last glance around the cabin. The passengers quickly looked away. Rachel watched him go, her face emotionless. The security officers flanked him, escorting him off the plane as if he were some criminal. With every step down the aisle, Jordan's shame deepened. He had never felt more powerless in his life. By the time he stepped back into the airport terminal, the excitement he had felt that morning was completely gone. And for the first time in his life, he understood what it meant to be judged before even being heard. The hum of conversations, the beeping of carts, and the constant announcements over the airport intercom were nothing but a blur to Jordan as he stood alone near Gate 14. His fingers clenched tightly around the straps of his backpack. His heart still pounded from the embarrassment, the disbelief, the unfairness of it all. His throat ached, but he refused to cry. Not here, not in front of all these people. The same people who had watched him get thrown off the plane and had said nothing. A few travelers walked past him, casting quick glances before looking away, as if they weren't sure whether to feel pity or indifference. He wanted to disappear, but instead, he just stood there, feeling the weight of his situation sink deeper and deeper into his chest, until someone called his name. "Jordan." The voice was firm, yet gentle, carrying a sense of authority that cut through the noise of the terminal. He turned and saw Monica Carter, the terminal manager for Summit Airways. She was in her late 40s with a sharp but compassionate expression, dressed in her navy blue airport uniform, a clipboard tucked under one arm. She knew him. She had seen him travel before, and the moment she saw him standing there alone, something in her expression changed. "Why are you here? Why aren't you on your flight?" Her voice was laced with concern, but Jordan hesitated. For some reason, saying it out loud made it feel worse. Monica's eyes scanned the area, noting the way passengers still whispered nearby, the way security officers had just walked away. Then she looked back at Jordan, studying his posture, the way his hands gripped his backpack too tightly, his eyes slightly puffy. Her frown deepened. "Jordan." "What happened?" Jordan exhaled shakily, forcing himself to find the words. "The flight attendant, she said I didn't belong in first class." Monica blinked. "She what?" Jordan swallowed hard. "I gave her my ticket, but she barely even looked at it. She said it was fake. She said I made it up." Monica stiffened, her fingers tightening on her clipboard. "You showed her your ticket?" she asked, her voice sharper now. Jordan nodded. "And she still accused you of forging it?" His silence was all the answer she needed. A wave of anger flashed across Monica's face. She had worked in this airport for 20 years. She had seen things before, people sneaking into different seats, passengers genuinely causing trouble, but this wasn't that. This was something else entirely, and she was not going to let it slide. "Stay right here," she said, pulling out her phone. Jordan shifted uncomfortably as Monica turned slightly away, dialing a number with precision and urgency. He heard her speaking into the phone, her voice low but firm. He caught only fragments. "Yes, I need to speak with immediately." "No, this is unacceptable." "Yes, it's his son." Jordan froze. She was calling his father. Within minutes, the energy in the terminal shifted. A tall, commanding figure strode through the terminal with purpose. Even before Jordan saw his face, he knew who it was. The conversations around them dimmed as people turned to stare at the man in the dark gray tailored suit, his polished shoes clicking against the tiled floor. Christopher Mitchell had arrived. His presence alone was enough to turn heads. Some people recognized him instantly, whispering amongst themselves. Others simply saw the power in his stance, the sharp focus in his gaze, and instinctively moved aside. When his eyes landed on Jordan, everything else disappeared. Christopher quickened his pace, kneeling in front of his son in one smooth motion, his large hands resting on Jordan's shoulders. "Are you okay?" His voice was low but intense, filled with concern, anger, and something deeper, protectiveness. Jordan hesitated before nodding. But Christopher wasn't convinced. He could see the redness in his son's eyes, the way his fingers clenched involuntarily, the way he was breathing too carefully, as if he was forcing himself to stay strong. Christopher exhaled sharply, his jaw tightening. He turned his gaze toward Monica. "Tell me exactly what happened," he said. Monica didn't hesitate. "The flight attendant removed him from the plane," she said. "She accused him of faking his ticket. She refused to check the system and had him escorted off the flight, in front of everyone." Christopher's eyes darkened. Jordan could feel the shift in his father's mood. "I see," Christopher said, his voice unnervingly calm, which meant he was furious. Monica nodded, sensing his controlled anger. "We need to fix this," she said. Christopher rose to his full height, adjusting his suit jacket. "I'll handle this." Christopher turned on his heel, his pace measured but forceful as he strode toward the plane. He wasn't just a man demanding answers. He was a CEO about to address a serious issue in his own company. Passengers in the waiting area watched with wide eyes, whispering as they recognized him. Monica followed closely behind, her grip tightening on her clipboard, and Jordan, despite feeling the burn of humiliation still lingering, felt something else too. A flicker of relief. His father was here. And no one, not a flight attendant, not an airline policy, not even the silence of the bystanders, was going to stop him from making things right. As they approached the jet bridge, Jordan felt the weight in his chest begin to shift. Because for the first time since stepping off that plane, he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't alone anymore. The moment Christopher Mitchell stepped onto the plane, the entire atmosphere shifted. The once casual hum of conversations died instantly. The flight attendants, who had been moving about preparing for takeoff, froze mid-step. The passengers, some scrolling through their phones, others sipping their pre-flight drinks, suddenly looked up, their eyes following the towering figure that had just entered the cabin. Christopher wasn't just a man boarding a plane. He was a force. His commanding presence filled the space, his sharp eyes scanning the cabin, searching for the one person responsible for what had just happened to his son. Rachel Simmons. She was standing near the first-class section, talking to another flight attendant, when she noticed the shift in energy. She turned, and the moment she locked eyes with Christopher Mitchell, she knew. Her entire face went pale. He approached with calm, deliberate steps, stopping directly in front of her. His piercing gaze never wavered, and the weight of his authority pressed down on her like a tidal wave. "Are you the flight attendant who removed my son from this plane?" Rachel's breath caught. Passengers were watching closely now, some whispering amongst themselves, recognizing him from news articles, from business magazines. She hesitated, then stammered, I didn't know he was your son." The moment the words left her mouth, Christopher's expression darkened. "That's irrelevant," he said, his voice sharp as steel. Rachel flinched. "You didn't check his ticket. You didn't verify the system. You made an assumption based on how he looks." His words hung heavy in the air, and even those who hadn't been paying attention before were now fully engaged. Jordan, standing just inside the entrance, could feel the shift in power. The shame and helplessness he had felt earlier began to fade, replaced by something stronger: vindication. Rachel opened her mouth, as if searching for an excuse, but Christopher wasn't interested in hearing it. He turned to the captain, who had just stepped out of the cockpit, clearly sensing that something major was unfolding in the first-class cabin. "This plane is not taking off until this is resolved." The captain, a man in his early 50s with silver-streaked hair and a no-nonsense expression, glanced between Christopher and Rachel. "Mr. Mitchell, what exactly is the issue here?" Christopher didn't break eye contact with Rachel as he spoke. "This flight attendant humiliated my son in front of this entire cabin. She refused to check his ticket, accused him of forging it, and had him forcibly removed, all because she assumed he didn't belong." A murmur rippled through the cabin. Passengers who hadn't known the full details of what had happened exchanged glances, their expressions shifting. Rachel took a step back, but Christopher wasn't done. "I run this airline," he continued, his voice carrying through the cabin, strong, unwavering. "And I will not tolerate discrimination, especially against a child." Rachel opened her mouth again, but no words came out. She knew there was nothing she could say that would fix this. Christopher took a deep breath and turned to face the entire first-class cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the delay," he began, his tone shifting from the icy authority he had used on Rachel to something more composed yet firm. "But this is not just a misunderstanding. This is about fair treatment." He let his words sink in before continuing. "My son had every right to be here, just like any other paying passenger. No one should be treated differently because of their appearance." Silence. Then applause. It started with one person, then another, until soon the entire first-class cabin erupted in applause. Passengers nodded in agreement, some muttering things like "he's right" and "that was unacceptable." Some even looked toward Rachel with disapproval, realizing the full weight of her mistake. For the first time since this all started, Rachel seemed truly rattled. The captain turned to Rachel, his face unreadable. "Rachel," he said, his tone carefully neutral, "you're relieved of duty for this flight." Rachel stiffened. "Captain, HR will be in touch," he cut her off. She stared in disbelief, but there was no room for argument. She had embarrassed the airline in front of its CEO, in front of dozens of passengers, and there was no coming back from that. With no other choice, she grabbed her belongings, her face ghostly pale, and walked off the plane in humiliating silence. Passengers watched as she left, some shaking their heads, others whispering. And then, just like that, she was gone. With Rachel removed from the flight, Christopher turned back to Jordan, his expression softening. He placed a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder. "Go take your seat, son." Jordan nodded, his confidence returning as he walked back to seat 2A, the very seat he had been forced to leave not long ago. This time, no one questioned him. No one dared. He sat down, adjusting his backpack beneath the seat, and exhaled deeply. The weight in his chest was gone. His father took the seat beside him, leaning over slightly. "You okay now?" Jordan nodded. "Yeah," he said, a small smile playing on his lips. "Thanks for coming, Dad." Christopher chuckled lightly, ruffling Jordan's hair. "Always." As the plane prepared for takeoff, Jordan felt something he hadn't felt in the last hour. Relief. And more than that, justice. As the plane soared through the sky, Jordan stared out the window, watching the city below shrink into the horizon. The events of the past hour still lingered in his mind, but for the first time since stepping onto the aircraft, he felt at peace. His father sat beside him, flipping through a document on his tablet, but Jordan knew Christopher Mitchell's mind was elsewhere. The confrontation on the plane hadn't just been about Jordan. It was bigger than him. It was about justice, respect, and ensuring that what happened to him wouldn't happen to anyone else. The moment their flight landed in Chicago, Christopher didn't waste any time. As CEO of Summit Airways, he had the power to make real change, and that's exactly what he intended to do. Within 24 hours, a corporate emergency meeting was called at the airline's headquarters. Seated at the long, polished conference table, a group of executives, legal advisors, and PR specialists listened intently as Christopher laid out the facts. What happened yesterday was not just an isolated incident, he stated, his tone firm. It was a failure in our training, our company culture, and our values. The room was silent. No one dared to interrupt him. Summit Airways cannot and will not be a company that allows discrimination, intentional or not, to exist within its ranks. He turned to the head of human resources. Rachel Simmons is to be terminated immediately. Her actions were unacceptable, and we will not protect employees who treat passengers unfairly. The decision was swift. Rachel was fired that same day. Her dismissal was made public, with an official statement from Summit Airways. We take matters of discrimination very seriously. We regret the incident that took place on Flight 382 and have taken appropriate disciplinary action. Moving forward, we are implementing mandatory diversity and inclusion training for all flight attendants and airport personnel. The story spread quickly. What had started as a shameful experience for Jordan turned into a national conversation about discrimination in air travel and customer service industries. Major news outlets picked up the story. Summit Airways CEO takes swift action after flight attendant accuses young black passenger of forging first-class ticket. How one 12-year-old's experience led to new airline anti-discrimination training. CEO Christopher Mitchell, no passenger should ever be judged by their appearance. Jordan, once the humiliated child on a plane, was now being spoken about in boardrooms, policy discussions, and social justice forums. His story mattered, and he wasn't done yet. One evening, as Jordan sat in his father's office at home, Christopher slid a folder across the desk. "I need your help with something." Jordan raised an eyebrow. "Me," Christopher nodded. "You've seen what happens when people in power don't step up. You felt it firsthand. Now I want you to be part of the change." Inside the folder were proposals for a new initiative. Summit Airways Equal Travel Initiative, ensuring fair treatment for every passenger. Christopher continued, "I want to create a program that educates flight attendants, gate agents, and customer service representatives about bias, both conscious and unconscious. I want stricter policies in place so that no one else goes through what you did." Jordan's eyes scanned the pages, taking in the mission statement, the training modules, and the new complaint reporting system that would ensure passengers could report discriminatory treatment without fear of being ignored. "And I want you involved," Christopher added. "I want you to help shape this, to be a voice for the passengers who don't always get heard." Jordan was stunned. A few days ago, he had felt powerless, as if his voice didn't matter. Now his father, the CEO of one of the largest airlines in the country, was telling him that it did matter, that he could help make sure no other kid had to go through what he did. Jordan sat up straighter. "Okay," he said, his voice steady. "I want to help." Christopher smiled. "Good, because this is just the beginning." Weeks passed, and Summit Airways began rolling out its new training programs. Employees attended mandatory workshops on identifying personal biases, providing equal treatment to all passengers, ensuring verification protocols are followed fairly. A new hotline was launched for customers to report discrimination, with an independent review team ensuring accountability. And at the center of it all, Jordan Mitchell. His story became a catalyst for change, inspiring other airlines to reevaluate their training programs. One evening, as he and his father sat together on their back porch, watching planes fly overhead, Christopher glanced over at him and said, "You taught the world an important lesson today." Jordan smiled, watching the distant lights of an aircraft blink against the night sky. He had gone through something painful, something unfair. but he had also turned that experience into something meaningful. He wasn't just the kid who got kicked off a plane anymore. He was a voice for fairness, for justice, for change. And that was worth more than any first-class ticket. This story is more than just an incident on a plane. It's a reflection of a much larger issue that still exists in our society today. Jordan Mitchell's experience is a powerful reminder that bias, whether intentional or not, has real consequences. Too often, people are judged by their appearance before they are given a chance to be heard. Jordan did everything right. He had a valid ticket, he followed the rules, and yet he was still treated as if he didn't belong. How many others have faced the same injustice without anyone to stand up for them? But what makes this story truly inspiring is the way it transforms injustice into action. Instead of letting this moment break him, Jordan took back his power. With the support of his father, he didn't just fight for himself. He fought for every person who has ever been made to feel like they don't belong. His story led to real change, not just for him, but for the entire airline industry. It proves that when we speak up, when we refuse to accept injustice, and when those in power choose to do the right thing, we can make the world a better place for everyone. So ask yourself, if you were a passenger on that plane, what would you have done? Would you have spoken up? Would you have questioned what was happening? Or would you have stayed silent, letting the moment pass? Because the truth is, real change doesn't just happen in corporate boardrooms. It happens in everyday moments, in the choices we make when we see something wrong. Jordan's story is a challenge to all of us. Stand up for what's right. Challenge unfair treatment when you see it. Never judge someone based on their appearance. And most importantly, always make sure that no one is treated as if they don't belong. Because fairness isn't a privilege, it's a right.